Government operations back in action on the 22nd of March, 2023. And we are looking at section 40 of S99, specific to the sort of broader conversation about how this interacts with government operations. So, Anthea, you want to introduce yourself and tell us just about this section?
So for the record, Anthea Dexter Cooper from the Office of Legislative Counsel. And if it works for the committee, I'd actually like to talk about sections 40, 41, 42, and 43, because they all go together.
Okay.
The main one and the one that I think you care about the most is section 40. And do you want me to put it up on the screen or are you not?
I think we all have it, so we can just look at it on paper or on screen.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do a big picture and then I'll do more of the details.
Great.
So section 40, this is all session law. It would be in subsection A saying what the DMV can do with respect to changes as part of its modernization project. And that's where you're going to get your notwithstanding language. Subsection B is the process that needs to be followed if there's going to be changes, and that involves the Joint Transportation Oversight Committee. Subsection C is what needs to happen after there have been changes in terms of getting statutes updated. And then subsection D and section 41 make this time limited, where the authority will go away on July 1 of 2025. Sections 42 and 43 make a small change, time limited, that's why the section appears twice, to the authority that the Joint Transportation Oversight Committee has, which is currently more limited to budget and finance matters than like DMV operations. I think the sections that will be the most interesting to this committee are going to be section 40A and 40B. So section 40A, right in the beginning, this is where you're getting your big, very broad notwithstanding. Notwithstanding anything in Title 23, that's the motor vehicles title, or any of the rules that are adopted under Title 23, the DMV can make reasonable, not defined, changes to existing DMV processes that are related to the second phase, the driver services component, part of their core system modernization project, provided that the commissioner gets approval from the Joint Transportation Oversight Committee under subsection B. Subsection B gives the process for that approval or disapproval. The commissioner, and this is under B1, needs to promptly report any anticipated changes to JTOC and needs to provide a detailed explanation for how statutes or rules will need to be amended in order to then align with the proposed change that the DMV is looking to make as part of that modernization implementation. Subdivision 2 says what happens if JTOC disapproves, and that needs to happen with notice of that disapproval and an explanation of the basis for the disapproval back to the commissioner, and JTOC has 30 days to do it. Subdivision 3 gives a second bite at the apple, so to speak. The DMV can try again if there's disapproval. And subdivision 4 says what happens if there is not disapproval within 30 calendar days, then the DMV can move forward. And that's of either the initial submittal or the revised submittal. Subsection C is what would then happen when you all are back in the building for purposes of the 2024 miscellaneous motor vehicle bill and the 2025 miscellaneous motor vehicle bill. The DMV, which is, for those of you who don't know how the miscellaneous motor vehicle bill and the T-bill work, the first versions of those bills are proposed by the Department of Motor Vehicles and the Agency of Transportation, respectively. They would need to include in that first version of the miscellaneous motor vehicle bills anything that would need to be amended in statute to have it be odd, whereas statute would need to conform with what they're already implementing, not sort of the other way around, which is what you are more used to. Subsection D, it just says this section shall continue in effect until July 1, 2025. And just to say it a second time, section 41 outright repeals all of section 40 effective on July 1, 2025. And there was a question on the floor yesterday about who is on JTOC. That is conveniently enough in section 42 on lines 15 down to 18, 15 down to 17. It's the 4 chairs of the money committees, 2 of which are either current or former members of the transportation committees, and the chairs of House and Senate Transportation. JTAC doesn't really meet. I don't think it's met in years. It hasn't met in the entire time that I've been here because it has sort of a pretty limited purpose at this point. In the balance of section 42, and you'll see this down in subsection C on lines 12 into 13. Currently, JTAC provides legislative oversight of the transportation fund revenues, collection, and the operation and administration of the Agency of Transportation, construction, paving, and rehabilitation programs. This is more than that, so it's amending the legislative oversight authority for the time period from July 1, 2023 to July 1, 2025. Also saying for purposes of like summonability that the secretary and the commissioner shall report to the committee upon request. And then section 43, which is effective on July 1, 2025, just puts everything back to the way that it is now. So
Okay.
that's your language.
Senator Watson.
Thank you. I had a question because I just lost where you
Oh,
were. Just before you were talking about section 43,
Mhm.
but I think I might have found you after you referenced that. But I do have another question, which is that something that would be helpful for me in understanding this is what does the process look like without this, just in Title 23? Like if this didn't exist, what would we be doing?
So if this didn't exist, the DMV, as the followers of the law and the enforcers of the laws and the implementers of the laws that are created by the General Assembly, would be looking at Title 23, and they can speak to this more in the details, as part of their implementation of Title 23 with things like what needs to be shown to get a driver's license or the fees for driver's license. They would then be implementing that as they are doing now. And I think they will speak to you about why they have concerns that there are going to be potential issues with Title 23 when it comes time to modernize their practices. But if you don't have this language, they're supposed to be following Title 23. I will say in practice, and I think this is language that you probably hear in committee more than you, as the writers of the law, would like to hear, oh, we just need to amend the statute to conform to current practice. Well, how did current practice end up deviating from statute? Sort of just did. So absent this, they should be following Title 23.
Okay, so I should ask other folks
I would
about
ask
what,
the DMV more.
okay,
the
about
specifics.
what that looks like. Okay, thank you.
And I will note that Title 23 has 41 chapters. So it's, you know, there's a lot, at least a lot of sub-chapters of, of the title. Okay, any other questions for Anthea?
Just
yeah,
a quick
Senator
one.
Morris.
So it does appear that there's oversight on this particular section now.
There is oversight through the Joint Transportation Oversight Committee and a process that's laid out for them to disapprove of anticipated
So
changes.
if in fact they don't receive approval, then the commissioner and DMV can't follow through with section 40 to begin with.
Well, it's not if they don't get approval, it's a subtle difference if they don't receive disapproval.
Disapproval,
Yes.
okay.
So
now-
silence would be approval specifically in language.
So that's our concern, then, silence. All right, thank
Senator
you.
White.
Thank you, Chair Hardy. So JTAC, I think you made a really good point, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about decisions they have made in the past. They don't meet typically.
So they meet if they choose to meet. They used to be required to meet for specific purposes, and they were involved. And you'll sometimes hear it mentioned like the JTAC appropriation, and that's the $20 million that goes to the Department of Public Safety. But like, it has nothing to do with JTAC now. It's just this like legacy thing. So, oh, it's the JTAC appropriation. So the Office of Legislative Counsel doesn't staff JTAC. The Joint Fiscal Office staffs JTAC. I've never been involved with it in any way whatsoever. I can tell you what the statute says, but I can't tell you much more than that. And I can tell you that it hasn't met recently.
Okay, so I don't know of a time when they have met in recent history either. So I'd love, perhaps there is an example of that, because While I respect your point, Senator Doris, I think my concern is that the oversight that we do have in this section has not necessarily been used as a mechanism for a while. So I'm just wondering,
To be clear, the oversight in here doesn't exist yet as a mechanism. It has
So-
been included in past T bills for limited purposes, you're on
Yeah.
transportation, related to if there was going to be additional federal money
yes.
to be spent. So this language in section 40 has been included in session law before, but it's not like there's been an opportunity related to DMV operations for this process to have been followed, and it hasn't been followed. This would be something new. It's a deviation from current.
And they did not meet around the federal funding.
But they didn't need to, because with the timing of when the IIJA came out, you were all practically back in the bill.
Okay, so that makes sense. So that's actually a good note for me to think about, because what I do also feel comfortable in I'm very divided on this language, I'll just say that. But one of the things that does give me comfortability is the fact that it sunsets, or maybe sunsets is the wrong word, but like the authority goes away after a period of time. And I will have more comfortability with it when I understand exactly what the requests would be related to, because I do think that the core man, I could go on, but the
Yeah,
core,
so why don't we,
Yes,
we stop
I'm gonna
on that.
stop on
We still
that.
have more testimony, and I think we're gonna hear from our chief counsel, Jennifer Kirby, because, one of my concerns with this is not necessarily specific to this part, but the broader implications for government operations and the precedent this sets, and the, division of, the legislative branch versus the executive branch. So if we could have Jen come up to the table and talk more broadly about this, that'd be great.
Good afternoon. Jen Kirby, Legislative Council. So yes, as I think the chair was teeing up, I think there are significant constitutional issues with the language as it's currently provided, specifically in the separation of powers. This is an extremely broad delegation of a core legislative function, which is to say, to make the law and to decide which laws are in effect and which are not. So I was actually marking up my pocket constitution. I think there are a few different constitutional provisions, one of which is that the legislature has the sole authority to suspend laws, and you can only do so sort of with particularity, and I don't think potentially suspending or allowing all of a title of the Vermont statutes annotated to be sort of suspended or suspendable at will over a 2-year period is complies with those requirements. There's a lot of case law on what's called the non-delegation doctrine, which is what this is. You basically be delegating your lawmaking authority to the executive branch to decide which provisions of law do and do not apply, and then kind of come back and tell you which ones they think you need to change to conform to what they are doing. And I don't think you can, I think there are potential constitutional issues with you doing that could have that authority struck down. So there are, and similarly, I don't think giving a subset of the legislature that has no authority, no independent lawmaking authority, the Transportation Oversight Committee, giving them authority to somehow bless the suspension or modification of laws or the application of laws is similarly problematic. So there's limited case law in Vermont, lots of case law, the federal level and nationally. But in order to delegate some authority, you need to be providing some clear, what at the US Supreme Court, they sometimes refer to as intelligible principles for the circumstances under which laws could be not withstood or modified. So if there are particular issues that DMV is concerned about coming up where they know of existing laws that could be problematic, or there are, and I don't know much of anything about the scope of what they're looking at with this project. So Anthea may be able to give more, and I know the commissioner chair may be able to give more examples. But if there are things around, say, the manner in which somebody is issued a driver's license, we could call out the types of things that the legislature would be comfortable if certain conditions were met. You know, if these things happen, then the commissioner may modify this. If you're kind of cabining it within certain parameters and not just ceding your lawmaking authority to another branch, then I think you're on much safer ground.
Yes, thank you very much, because that was my concern, not only the constitutional issues, but the precedent it sets for any agency or department to come in here and say, hey, for 2 years, we don't want to follow the law. And unless we hear from you, we're going to just do whatever we want, which is sort of what this says to me. And during the pandemic, we did, in fact, we just did the fourth version of this bill that we did. We provided a lot of regulatory flexibility to healthcare providers, hospitals and physicians and all sorts of healthcare entities. But we did so with very clear parameters and a very clear purpose for why we were doing it. And then a very clear timeline, which we've extended a lot in certain cases, but we have done so with very clear parameters. And this has almost no parameters. And it's an entire title of the statutes. It's a lot is in there. And so I just want to, as the chair of government operations, not set the precedent that this is what we are going to do with delegating legislative authority to the executive branch. Jen, are you able to stick around, or what's your timeline?
Yeah,
Okay.
no, I'm good. I can.
Yeah, are there any other questions for Jen? Senator White?
Thank you, Chair Hardy. So when you say that there's maybe some friction constitutionally, what kind of legal mechanism would happen? Like, what happens if we, what if we were to pass this law?
If we did it?
Yeah, what would be the?
So depending on what might be modified, I mean, the issue with the language as it's set up is it provides no notice to the public of what the law is.
Yeah.
So if somebody were not able to do something the way the law currently says that they can do it because the department had kind of suspended that law or withheld that law, then they may challenge the basis on which that authority was provided to the department.
So can I
they
ask
can bring
you,
it by bringing the lawsuit.
so an example would be, let's say one of these changes did go through that affected Title 23, and a constituent or someone in the community said, actually, that change, the way that you did it is unconstitutional. Could it would go through the court process and then maybe make all of that work not legally something that could have been done? Like, could it void, like, I guess it makes me now concerned about the risk factor of, let's say that we did pass this, changes were made, someone could bring a lawsuit, and it sounds like there is maybe a reason that they could get all of those changes removed. Like, it would.
I think,
I guess I'm not following which changes you're talking
If
about.
they
that would be
could,
getting
if
removed.
it happened and it got implemented.
so what, for example, if
Yeah.
they, through the course of their work, changed like the specific requirements to get a driver's license.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
somebody was denied a driver's license because of the change in the law that's on the new website or in the new system.
Yes.
And they said, well, under law, I should have been able to get the driver's license, but under this new thing, I was denied a driver's license. They could sue saying they should have been able to get a driver's license because the law, Title 23,
Yeah.
says these are the parameters for getting a driver's license. These are the rules. And is that a fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of, ifs that have to happen, but yes, they would be challenging the basis on which the MV was implementing the law in a manner other than what is in the actual statute books.
Okay.
I will say, in the language in here, and again, deferring to others for what that means, where it talks about making changes to DMV processes, I mean, to the extent they're not processes that are in statute or potentially in rule, I don't know that there's as much of a problem there because they're not things that are happening because they're in Title 23. But it seems like some of them, or at least that are being contemplated, are statutory.
Yeah, so the one thing I will just point out, and I think DMV will speak to this more, is much like there's sort of like a lead up to a phase and then a rollout of it, there's gonna be like a discrete point in time when something is happening. So I don't want to speak for the DMV, I've just heard so much more testimony about this. I think it has more to do with the planning for implementation, and then there's a point in time where it will be implemented, and there's like the potential for a catch-up period. So I don't think they're gonna catch up, like,
Okay.
so they're programming for a future rollout, and it's not like tomorrow they're going to be changing who can get a driver's license. And I think we need to hear more from the DMV to understand.
Yeah, and we
Okay.
will hear from them right now. Actually.
Sorry, thank you for.
Did you just catch the secretaries on, or then we're gonna have a committee amendment?
Yeah, so I think there should, it seems like there should be a way to get people where you want, where they want to go. I just think we need to tighten it up significantly.
Agreed, and.
Even if
that's
they
why-
don't know what the specifics are yet, I think we can come up with categories or, chapters, narrow it,
Yes,
narrow the scope, give sort of rationales for, they would need to do it in, without waiting for the legislature to come back because certain conditions were met.
Yeah.
So I think that's typically, in the main case that has been taken up by our Vermont Supreme Court, Hunter versus State, that dealt with delegation issues and actually involved Senator Kitchell back when she was Secretary of Human Services. But it was about a challenge to the emergency board process. And one of the things that they were really focused on was the time sensitive nature, the major impact on the state's finances if the changes weren't able to be made when the legislature was out of session. And kind of the delegation to the emergency board, which was legislators and the governor, but with very clear, if these certain conditions are met, then this action can occur. And they said, in this circumstance, that is okay, but the bar is fairly high, even though there have not been a whole lot of cases that have found improper delegation. It's because they always point to, because there were these standards set out in the legislation, and so it's not a delegation issue.
okay, great, that is really helpful. So Commissioner Manoli, I know you're like chomping at the bit, you want to come up and talk about it?
know, it's very warm in here. I think
I know.
I'm sweating at the bit.
I was,
So anyways,
well, thank you for joining us. I know we're not a committee you usually see, so we're gonna just introduce ourselves really quickly so you know who you're talking to. I'm Senator Ruth Hardy.
Olivia Parker, Committee Assistant. Senator Tanya Vihovsky.
And Rebecca White, Windsor County District.
Bob Norris, Franklin County.
And Watson, Washington District.
And this is Senator Clarkson, who's next door and will be joining us in a little bit. So Commissioner, just introduce yourself and tell us about this specific.
absolutely. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to come in and talk about this. And I do want to congratulate all of you. There's many new members sitting here, so I think that's great. In just listening to the conversation that occurred, I want to say to the committee, and to me, this is really important. The intent of this language is not to introduce or modify law when you're not in session. It's not for us to not to follow the law. And that to me is really, really important, because I feel like I heard that expressed in a couple of ways. We are undergoing the largest modernization project. You are all aware of that. A previous representative, now a senator, worked with us very closely on that project. And everything that sometimes is about lessons learned and experiences. So we have been undergoing the vehicle service, the phase one, and the financial system, and we're in the process of implementing that. We're moving to testing, and there's a whole host of steps that you go through. And part of the difficulty as a commissioner when you are brought forth a project like this, and I think you referenced there are over 40 chapters. Title 23, there are sections of law that have not been modified since 1993. Maybe Athena's modified some that went back to the 60s. And I say that with a smile on my face, but we have worked in this system for so long that you don't always have the opportunity to spend time to bring your statutes in alignment with best practices and businesses without changing the intent. And again, we are not here, and we did not engage in this conversation with the Senate because we want to change the intent of statute. We respect the process. What we learned currently in the vehicle service module, and we do weekly meetings with leadership, and the process, first you map out your existing process, then you move into your definition phase, then you move into a design phase. And then there comes a point where you have opportunity with a Cox solution to create efficiencies in flow. You look at every statute, everything that we're touching in vehicle services, our team goes through every statute and they look at it and they say, does our statute and the system and the benefits of the system, do they align? And when they don't, we have to sit down and we have to have a policy discussion. We ran into two particular ones in this session, in the vehicle service session, where I had to make a business decision, which is aligning the system with what the best practices are, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and what our statute says. And there are two items particular that's in the miscellaneous bill that we're asking permission to change while we're designing the system as if it were going to change. And now over on the side, I'm saying, if we don't get the language, and I know that that's a risk for this, then I have to come up with a manual process to do this. So I lose all efficiencies with the opportunities, with the tools that you've given us with the system. And I feel like that just sounded like a riddle, and it wasn't intended to be a riddle. So I am sitting here before you and I understand your concerns, and I look at this modernization as a partnership and an opportunity. So the intent in going into the Senate with a miscellaneous bill is saying, how can we work together so I don't have a gap? And so when you are off session and now we're in the design piece and we run into an issue with, and it could have been drafting, and everything that I've looked at, I have engaged with counsel. I don't do it in isolation. I ask our counsel from the AG's office to look at it, and so I sit there and then I'm put in a position to keep the project on time to make this operational decision, where if you were here full time, it would be a different conversation. And that's not the answer. So I'm looking for a tool and a partnership with the legislature to help advance the right opportunities and business decisions. Not here to do something else and to break to change the relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch. I have 37 years in state government. I respect and honor what those systems are and the processes that are in place. So that's just based on what I've heard and your concern that I'm talking about, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, I guess, well, one, it concerns me that the statutes in this area are so out of date and nobody has taken the time to do a, deep dive into changing the statutes, especially given that we have a T-bill and a miscellaneous CMV bill every year. It seems like we have opportunities to do those updates, and it's a little disheartening.
I'm sorry, we do every year. We're cleaning up since I've been commissioner, and we do work on that. But a deep dive is
okay.
as you can well understand is.
Yes,
it's very
very
deep. So we have diligently been updating and bringing statute. We're very sensitive to gender. And I'm going to give Ledge Council credit. I may propose something. They do research and take it beyond to make sure everything aligns. So we've done some good work on that over the years. We can't project. It's very difficult until we get to the design phase of what are going to be those elements that could pop up. There might not be any.
Right. So I also, you're not the only agency in state government or department in state government that's going through a sort of modernization project. And pretty much every committee in this building is working with somebody who's going through some kind of big overhaul of their technology system. I do a lot of work in childcare. That's one of the big ones that I hear about constantly. And that's one of the reasons we have Secretary Naylor here, is because broadly, most areas of state government have the problems you have. And they're not asking to, you know, not withstand an entire title of state law. So how do your colleagues manage the same kind of problems that you are talking about?
I can't speak to
Okay.
my colleagues. I can speak to the first phase and what we've experienced and the methodology that we have in place and timing. And what I can tell you is that, you know, everything stays the same. We go live on phase 1 in November of this year. Very excited about that. And we are scheduled to start phase 2 around February. In February of next year, if I'm aware of anything, that I'll bring that forward. But once the session ends and I move into design and implementation, and now we're in July, there's a loss of 6 months. So I can't speak to others. I can tell you that to be able to make the best decision in partnership with the legislature in a situation like this is the way to go. This is, I think, a very creative way. That's the intent. That's what we are trying to do. So we don't delay the project, or we don't make business decisions that, and I'm not exaggerating, but you know, the word is shall and it should be may. To be able to have the agility. I'm not looking at changing fees or, you know, I mean, the intent and the expectation of what the language is what I want to manage, but I may have to have some agility.
Well, there's a big difference between shall and may, and that's something we talk about all the time in this building. So you heard the conversation about, you know, needing to have guardrails. And so it would be really helpful if you could give us some guardrails that we could put into the bill as an amendment. Specifically, what is your first phase about? And, you know, what are you trying to do with your first phase of your technology modernization?
We're almost done that one. We're moving, this is for phase 2.
Oh, for phase 2.
That's
So
why
what is,
it's limited to driver services.
well, this is not limited to driver services.
So I enjoyed hearing the conversation today and the
Yeah.
interpretation, because the intent, and you know, and I don't want to muck this up, but the intent is to focus on the work that is going to be behind the driver services module, which we call phase 2. I read the language that it is identified in other areas. I may be too close to that. So when I read this language, and it says it's got the limited, the window, and it talks about in section 40A, I think line 20, it says processes related to driver services. Maybe one of the things we could do is come up with the definition of what driver services is, right? Because we're not, so for me.
But in Title 23, where does driver services?
Driver
appear?
services is the module that's in this core modernization. That's what we're calling, it's the phase 2 is the driver service modules, and that is related to all processes around anything
Does it have anything
license.
to do with snowmobiles, ATVs, gasoline tax,
No.
diesel fuel tax?
No,
So we could go through each of these chapters and see,
Yeah.
you know, we
I
don't
am-
need to have those things in here.
right.
And we can narrow it down to the specific things, and then for the specific purposes that you need it for, so we can outline that in the amendment. That's what I'm talking about.
No,
is
I
that
understand
We really
your
need
point.
to narrow it and focus it in on
Mhm.
specifics, and then have a much stronger
Yeah.
kind of approval process, not a silence is approval.
So, and that I appreciate, and I did hear that in how you read the language. I hadn't, that's why I said, this is our intent. It wasn't to take all of Title 23, and I understand the notwithstanding. Well, it's not our intent to all of a sudden go in and say, well, you know what? We don't like the total absence program, so we're gonna go to the JTOC committee, and that's
Right.
not the intent.
Well, that's great to hear. And then also, this also includes any rules too. And I speaking to the former chair of the legislative committee on administrative rules, they are not happy with that either. So we want to make sure we are limiting the rules and the statutes that this may apply to and why. So I want to bring Secretary Naylor up here, and maybe you can start thinking about that, and we can bring you back up after you've had a chance to maybe think about it, because we have to do an amendment, I think, today, unless we really don't have time, we can pass over the bill again, but, so, yeah, so why don't we hear from Secretary Naylor, and then we can.
I think we would have to go off and
Okay.
work and have some conversation.
Okay.
So do you want us to do that, or would you like us to wait?
Why don't you wait, and then we'll see what we might be able to work out. Okay, Secretary Naylor, good to see you again.
Good afternoon.
You, as you testified to us yesterday, you are working with DMV on this project. And so I wanted, and I asked you yesterday sort of that question of how could we narrow this down? What specifically might you need? And I'm wondering, have you had a chance to think about that?
So what we started talking about yesterday was like the why, right? And because it seemed like it was in response. So for the record, Sean Naylor, Secretary of Digital Services, response to the idea that technology not drive policy. And so I brought a simple handout that I will share here for everyone to just kind of look at and digest. But I want to start by answering that question first, which is really this is process driven, not technology driven. And in that when we are doing an implementation, it doesn't matter, the technology that we're moving towards is doesn't factor into it as much as the process that we follow, which is really about, as the commissioner alluded to, right? The first thing we do is we look at our current processes and we inventory them and kind of get a sense of where they are. That's the first box. Then we define like the ideal state. What could we do ideally based on the technology that we're looking at? What's the current best practices? What's available? And then we design to that. And then that's where the commissioner was talking about, where we look at it and assess what needs to change or can it change. And you were talking earlier, and then all that happens. And then from there is when we go down actually building the solution, testing it, and
Yeah.
right. And so this is what the solution is secondary to the responsible process of looking at what you're doing. And are you just perpetuating old processes in modern technology, or are you really looking at making advancements based on what the technology offers? And you asked earlier what are others doing? And I'll say it's a mix of how they're approaching it. In the current modernizations, DMV is the one that has the most rules and statute that this would apply to. Many of the things that we're working on modernizing the state's enterprise resource planning system, right, for human capital management, finance, and budget. Not a lot that's in statute that defines those things. Those are very much defined by the governor's office and the secretary of administration through policy and stuff. So we've not encountered it as much. Often what will happen, and this is where I want to give DMV credit for, is they'll just accept what's in statute and adopt inefficient processes to meet what's in statute to keep a project moving forward. Versus what DMV is trying to do is figure out a way by which, how can we, without breaking the trust, be empowered to choose efficiency that will lead to, legislative change that will bring that efficiency to Vermonters. And as I think through the current modernization projects, I think this could be relevant also for the unemployment insurance system. That one is another one that, as we look at it, and their processes are based on their technology stack, which is 50+ year old mainframe. So the processes are formed, at this point, cast in stone around that technology. And
Yeah.
we're gonna need to figure out, either we're gonna perpetuate antiquated processes with new technology, or figure out a way by which we can, when it does come to this legislative component of it, how do we not keep the projects held up while we wait to get that sorted out? And, you know, you talked about it yesterday, you know, a lot of projects run slow, and sometimes this is one of them, is the internal hand wringing of, do we try and change it? Do we just move forward and adopt the old process and stuff like that?
Yeah, and so another thing that sometimes agencies do is they, what is the saying? They act first and get forgiveness later. So they say, oh, well,
I'm not gonna party to
Yeah,
that.
I'm sure that's never happened. And your point about this may be relevant to the Department of Labor and is exactly why we need to get this right now, so that we have something that's not just, okay, every time we have a technology project, we're gonna, withstand a whole bunch of statute in order to make sure it's on time. But how do we deal with it so that you have the flexibility you need without putting us into a constitutional conundrum and a legal conundrum? So that's what I'm looking for as, the government operations committee. How can we do this as something that might be replicable at other agencies and departments? So Senator White.
Yes, so I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to what kind of precedents you've seen or other states, what they've done to allow some of the efficiency to happen, but also maintaining the adherence to like the legislative process, because I think what we're balancing right now is that efficiency and speed of doing things.
Mhm.
But one of the problems with democracy is that we are slower. We're much slower than most other processes. And that's one of the things that can hold up the IT modernization. And I'm wondering if you've seen other states that struck a balance, especially, I mean, any, like, if there was something that has worked with having an interim.
We have it because, like I said, this is really the first one that gets into something that is so heavily defined in statute. And so and that would maybe be a better question for the DMV folks, is if they've talked to states and figured out how they've done it while they're implementing the project. But we've not had to address this to that scale. Often if it has an impact to existing law, it's either minor or the project is such that they will shelve that piece of it while they work on other facets of it. So then they come here to get the law changed. Given the breadth, as you outlined in Title 23, that's hard to do when everything pretty much that DMV does is somehow outlined in statute. And so that's where this is really kind of the first place we've seen it to this scale.
So there isn't necessarily a comparable state because this isn't brand, we're just coming right up on this new topic.
For us, it's not something that we've spent any time trying to research in advance of this to find out if there are states. I'm sure they probably are all slightly different, right? Like we're 50 unique states. You've seen one state, and but I mean that's something that I think as we do, I'm sorry, didn't mean to cut you off, but just as we do the labor one, as we're preparing for that, I think that is going to be something that we can start doing now. Ourselves in cooperation with the Department of Labor, is how do we anticipate this and what does that look like?
Exactly. The more you can anticipate and plan for it, the better. And I think every state is different. I mean, there are some legislatures that are literally in session for like 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And then they're gone. So they must have completely different executive branch powers than we do. So
There's not really a big.
I lived in Texas for a couple of years and do a lot of things differently there. Senator Watson.
Yeah, thank you. So as I'm like building a list in my head of like, okay, if we're going to amend this, what would it be? And so I'm hearing, narrowing what gets notwithstanded, narrowing what it's for, or at least defining what it's for. There's this other thing that I feel like I'm not quite sure what to do with, which is this idea of legislative intent. Like, if you're going to make changes, they've got to be pointed towards some some legislative intent. And so does legislative intent end up in statute somewhere?
It
Like,
ends up, it sometimes does, and courts use it all the time.
so, yeah, maybe this is,
This is a Jen.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that's kind of
Was
the first
Jen
bit
here?
of it, right?
Yeah.
Oh, Jen.
yeah.
That's-
Sorry that this is not.
No, no,
This is
no, I
sometimes
think
ends
it's
up in
it's a
session.
really good question, and it has certainly come up with, bills in this area, let's just say. Do you want to take that question, Jen? or-
Sure, sometimes we put intent in statute, often we put it in the legislation, but in the session law pieces that don't go into the green books.
Yep.
But I think in this area, it would probably be something we would build into the language around whatever discretion it is that you're providing. And, whether you wanted to make an explicit intent statement and give some flexibility, I think you can work it in there, but I think it's all about kind of trying to understand what it is that you are empowering the executive branch to do in service of something for the legislature, something about the law.
Well, and I bring that up too, because I mean, it seems like it has to do with our sort of broader collectively held goals, like around equity. And, like, so, because we wouldn't want to make changes that take us so further away from that, right? And so but it's also like the intent part of it is a little bit more like poetry, so it's hard to like come up with like on the fly. Anyway, I'm just.
Yeah, I mean, I would be reluctant to encourage poetry-like intent if what you're really looking to do is create the basis for which you are granting some somewhat unusual authority to an executive agency. I think what you're really looking to do is kind of set those parameters for, here's what we're trying to get to. We're trying to get to a modernized motor vehicle system that works well for all Vermonters. And so in getting to this next stage of it, we are allowing DMV to have flexibility in these specific areas for these particular reasons until this particular date.
Yeah, okay.
So I guess what it sounds like is that, and I heard from the commissioner, you would need more time to figure out with your people the narrower parameters. Ideally we would have something for tomorrow, but I can talk to my colleagues. Is it possible to work, or is it possible for you guys to work with DMV?
So Madam, I mean, we'll try to accommodate your schedule. And my request is, may I work with Ledge Council on trying to accommodate that? And I think that's key.
It's totally fine with me. Before leaving, I'm just gonna run through my little list of possible options that I made, and if Jen has additional ones to make sure that I'm understanding what the committee wants to use as their pathing approach. So, it sounds like from listening to what Commissioner Manoli testified to, they're not starting this up until February of 2024. So you can make sections 40 and 42 effective on May or June 1, 2024. So narrow it from 2 years to 1 year. Potentially defining driver services and specify chapters within Title 23 and specific rules to not withstand. Flip what is a disapproval process to an approval process. And then I started to write down points of legislative intent, thinking you were going to say work to legislative intent in Title 23, but it sounds like that's not what you were looking for, but instead have what I'm going to sort of say, like, the goal of this project is to efficiencies for Vermonters, which would sort of frame the legislative intent around the discretion that's being given to the commission. And then for purposes of like maybe defining what's a reasonable change or narrowing to some sort of triggering language, like if the change can, needs to be made in order to proceed to the next phase of the project, and it will delay things greater than X amount of time.
Yeah, I think
That's what I wrote.
that sounds like a good list. I would say just for my comfort level, as narrow as possible, as specific as possible. So even if it's subchapters of the law, I think there's a lot in there that is totally irrelevant to this project that we don't need to notwithstand. And specific rules also, or series of rules. I don't know how the rules work in DMV, but probably series of rules. Having, yes, an approval, not a disapproval process. it seems like the timeline, I saw you shaking your head.
I was
So-
processing it, and so
Yeah.
I do not play poker. I want to have more because
Yeah,
I watch
don't worry
the
about it.
space.
None of us are poker faces.
You know, so I.
Except for Bob.
So.
Actually,
I think I was processing, I was processing what I heard Anthea, say, so I'll be happy.
Okay,
Take what she, if she ends up drafting something, being able to read. and
yeah,
digest
as
and-
narrow a timeline as possible, and then I'm gonna say this, Jen, I heard J Talk is not staffed by Ledge Council, and since this would be about, legislative, statutes, I would want Ledge Council to have its eyes on whatever comes before J Talk too, not just JFO. So,
Put something in there as long as it doesn't involve long-term
yeah, I know.
staffing
I know,
of it.
I was reluctant to say that, but I also just feel like for this is a specific, this is not really JFO, this is you guys.
I mean, I think if you want to build in the J-Talk piece for your comfort, I don't know that that's necessarily required for legal purposes, as far as meeting the delegation issues, but I think if that's, if that sort of checking in with the legislature part feels important, it's totally fine.
Yeah, I mean, it's in there already, so we can build on that, I think,
But I think
just,
just getting, I would like an understanding, we can draft it, or from the commissioner, just the timeline
yeah,
of how this all works, so that we can figure out where to do things.
yeah. So if you're willing to work on, and then see if we can get an amendment tomorrow to look at, and to the extent necessary, checking in with Secretary Naylor as well, because he's the. What are you guys doing?
We're being very efficient up here, sorry.
They're messing with me.
Yeah, you know what I mean, just to get us a draft to consider, that meets your needs, but also keeps the parameters on it. Just committee, does that sound good?
Yeah.
Senator White?
Madam Chair, I'm just wondering, process wise, is this a committee amendment? Because do we have possession of the bill?
We don't have possession of the bill.
Yes.
So I don't know.
I just,
Legally,
no, I
we
just
can-
talked to Melissa,
Yeah,
in the hall, and she said that if we had an amendment that we should put our names on it
Yeah,
rather
that's
than the
what
committee.
yeah, so we would just, whoever wants to, I mean, hopefully we'd all want to sign on to it.
Keep that to Olivia.
Why don't I start with all members? and then say if there are one?
Yeah, that
I
sounds
think
great.
that's perfect.
So I will touch base with the chair of transportation to make sure that he understands what's going on. But if, we don't meet again until tomorrow afternoon, so.
So for our purposes, I know for our planning purposes, when you say tomorrow, do you mean tomorrow afternoon or do you mean tomorrow morning to Senate transportation? Because they do have this on their agenda for 9 a.m.
I know,
If
and,
possible.
well, we won't be able to meet unless we meet at 8:30 tomorrow. But if that
I have a meeting at 8.
is.
Don't,
Isn't
Natural Resources meeting at 8:30 tomorrow?
Did we move it to 9?
Yes.
Thursday is
Yeah.
normally 9. I thought we moved it to 8. He said 8:30, which, because there's no L credit this week.
Okay.
You meant 8.
We could do 8.
Idea.
Five.
Reminds me.
After they look at it.
Okay.
You would want, you would
Senator
like to make sure.
Yeah.
Would like Wilson work, and maybe Senate transportation.
Just go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's talk about the specific details because tomorrow morning is complicated with my other committee because we don't have a quorum if I'm not there.
And some other committees are
So-
beginning at 8.
I would like to pass over the bill and have it done Friday if possible. That works better. And then you would have more time and we could meet tomorrow afternoon.
It certainly is
Yeah.
easier,
Yeah, exactly.
Tomorrow.
So I'll see if I can make that work. And thank you all. Thank you, Commissioner, for coming in and really explaining what you're looking for. And hopefully we can get you what you need and have us retain legislative oversight and authority. And thank you, Secretary Naylor, for being here yesterday and today. And it's nice to see you again. It's used to have you back in. We'll come up with something else too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'd love to come back and talk about something like artificial intelligence or cybersecurity.
Oh, yeah, yeah. You have-
Well,
Yes.
And also, hopefully we're not still using